1860, Sicily. To understand the Mafia, you must first strip away the cinematic glamour of the modern gangster. You must forget the tailored suits, the high-stakes poker games, and the neon lights of New York City. To find the true origin of this shadow empire, we have to travel back to a land defined not by law, but by soil, sweat, and a crushing, ancient hierarchy. For centuries, Sicily was governed by a rigid, decaying system of feudalism. The island was a patchwork of vast estates, known as latifondi, owned by a tiny, absentee aristocracy. These were the great landlords, men who lived in the opulent palaces of Palermo or even in distant cities, viewing their Sicilian holdings not as communities, but as mere sources of extraction. Underneath them were the peasants, the contadini, who worked the scorched earth from sunrise to sunset. They lived in a state of perpetual servitude, bound to the land, and to the whims of masters who were often nothing more than names on a deed. This was a society built on a profound imbalance. The landlords held the wealth, but they had no interest in the day-to-day governance of the people. They didn't care about local disputes, stolen livestock, or the protection of the villages. They cared only for the harvest and the rent. This created a devastating structural flaw, a vacuum of power. In the rural heartlands of Sicily, there was no functional police force. There were no judges who could be reached, no state officials who cared to traverse the rugged, mountainous terrain to settle a grievance. The law was a ghost, a theoretical concept discussed in distant courts, but entirely absent from the dusty streets of the Sicilian interior. When a farmer's crops were stolen or a family was threatened, there was no one to call. The state was not a protector. It was an intruder, a tax collector that arrived only to take, never to give. In this void, a new kind of authority began to crystallize. If the state would not provide order, someone else would. Enter the Gabelati. These were the estate managers, men hired by the absentee landlords to oversee the latifondi. They were the bridge between the aristocratic elite and the peasant masses. The Gabelati were often men of immense local influence, possessing the muscle and the ruthlessness required to enforce the landlord's will. They collected the rents, managed the laborers, and most importantly, they dispensed a primitive, unofficial form of justice. They became the arbiters of the land. If you needed protection, you went to them. If you had a dispute, they settled it, often through the threat or application of violence. They were not technically criminals in the eyes of the landlords. They were essential tools of management. But in the eyes of the people, they were something else entirely. They were the first architects of a private system of power. They realized that in a land where the law is absent, power belongs to those who can most effectively wield fear. The vacuum left by the crumbling feudal system didn't remain empty for long. It was filled by men who understood that in Sicily, land wasn't just dirt and stone. It was the ultimate currency of control. This was the crucible. This was the moment the seeds of the Mafia were sown into the very earth of the island. 1870, Sicily. The transition from the individual estate manager to a structured criminal organization did not happen overnight, but it was inevitable. As the Gabelati grew in influence, they realized that their power was not limited to a single estate. They began to form alliances with one another, creating a network of influence that spanned entire provinces. This was the moment the protection racket evolved into something far more sophisticated, more permanent, and infinitely more dangerous. They began to organize into what we now call the casca. The term casca itself is a metaphor rooted in the very soil of Sicily. It refers to the heart of an artichoke, a tightly packed, layered core that protects the center from the outside world. This was the perfect descriptor for the emerging mafia structure, a group of men bound by blood, geography, and a shared interest in maintaining a private monopoly on power. The evolution was driven by a simple, predatory logic. If you can provide order, you can charge for it. It began with the concept of pietz, the protection tax. In the vacuum of the Sicilian interior, the casca offered a grim bargain to the rising class of small landowners, merchants, and livestock traders. They would approach a man and offer him protection. This didn't mean protection from the state. The state was irrelevant. It meant protection from the very men offering the deal. It was a protection from theft, from violence, and from the chaos of a lawless land. But the price for this peace was a permanent tribute. To refuse the pizzo was to invite the very destruction you were paying to avoid. But the casca was more than just a collection of extortionists. They were becoming a shadow government. As these local cells organized, they developed a rigid internal hierarchy. They weren't just thugs working for themselves, they were members of a brotherhood. They began to assign roles. The men who provided the muscle, the men who managed the finances, and the men who acted as the intermediaries between the underworld and the legitimate world. This hierarchy ensured that even if one man was arrested or killed, the structure remained intact. The casca was designed for survival. Crucially, this organization allowed them to move beyond mere extortion and into the control of the local economy. They didn't just tax the harvest, they controlled the distribution of water, the movement of cattle, and the very labor required to work the land. By controlling the resources, they ensured that no one could prosper without their blessing. They became the gatekeepers of Sicilian life. This was no longer a series of disconnected criminal acts. This was a systematic, organized takeover of the social fabric. The casca had successfully weaponized the instability of Sicily. They had taken the chaos of a lawless land and forged it into a tool of absolute control. They were no longer just managers of estates. They were the masters of a new, invisible state. The stage was now set for a criminal entity that would not only dominate the island, but would eventually project its shadow across the Atlantic, forever changing the nature of organized crime in the modern world. 1880, Sicily. If the casca was the body of this new shadow government, then its soul was a concept far more elusive and more terrifying: omertà. To understand the Mafia, one must understand that it was never merely a criminal enterprise. It was a psychological fortress. While the casca provided the physical structure of power, omertà provided the armor. It is often translated simply as the code of silence, but to call it that is to strip it of its true, suffocating essence. Omertà was not just the refusal to speak to the police. It was a total cultural rejection of the state. It was the belief that justice sought from an outsider, from a government, a judge, or a policeman, was not only useless, but a profound betrayal of one's own community. The psychological foundation of omertà rested on a singular, grim premise. In the eyes of a Sicilian under the thumb of the casca, the law was an alien entity. The state was a distant, often predatory force that did not understand the local customs, the local bloodlines, or the local struggles. Therefore, to cooperate with the authorities was to commit an act of treason against one's own neighbors, one's own family, and one's own dignity. This created a social environment where silence became a virtue and speech became a death sentence. The Mafia did not need to police every citizen through constant violence. They did it through the cultivation of a collective conscience. They turned the community into their own surveillance network. In a village governed by omerta, every closed door and every averted gaze served as a silent reinforcement of the code. To witness a crime and report it was to become a pentito, a collaborator, a term that carried a social stigma more permanent than any prison sentence. But omerta was also a weapon of psychological warfare used against the members themselves. For a man within the casca, the code was a test of masculinity and loyalty. It was the ultimate gatekeeper. You did not join the mafia simply by proving you could kill. You joined by proving you could endure the weight of a secret. The bond was forged in the shared knowledge that if you broke, you would not only lose your life, but you would destroy the lives of everyone you loved. The mafia understood a fundamental truth of human nature. A man might face death with courage, but he will do almost anything to protect his children from the consequences of his own weakness. This made the organization nearly invisible to the traditional tools of law enforcement. How do you prosecute a crime when there are no witnesses? How do you dismantle a conspiracy when the victims themselves refuse to testify, often out of a mixture of genuine fear and a misplaced sense of honor? Omerta turned the very fabric of Sicilian society into a shield. It created a world where the truth was something to be buried, and where silence was the only currency that bought survival. It was this psychological stranglehold, this ability to command the silence of an entire population, that allowed the mafia to grow from a local protection racket into a sophisticated, untouchable empire. They had mastered the art of being present in everything, yet visible in nothing. 1861, Palermo, Sicily. If omerta was the psychological shield that protected the mafia, then the unification of Italy, the Risorgimento, was the political forge that hammered it into a weapon of systemic power. For centuries, Sicily had existed as a collection of fragmented kingdoms, a crossroads of Mediterranean cultures that functioned under its own ancient, feudal logic. But as the mid-19th century approached, a new force began to sweep across the peninsula, the dream of a single, unified Italian nation. To the revolutionaries and the intellectuals in the north, unification meant progress, modernity, and the rule of law. But to the Sicilian peasant and the local landowner, unification felt less like a liberation and more like a foreign invasion. When the forces of Giuseppe Garibaldi swept through the island, they promised to tear down the old feudal structures. They promised to replace the distant, often negligent Bourbon monarchy with a centralized Italian state. But there was a catastrophic flaw in this grand design. The new Italian government, rushed and politically unstable, possessed immense ambition but almost zero administrative reach. They could claim sovereignty over Sicilian soil on a map in Rome, but they could not project authority into the rugged, sun-scorched hills or the labyrinthine alleys of Palermo. This created a massive, dangerous vacuum. The old feudal lords were being stripped of their titles, and the new Italian state was too weak, too corrupt, and too far away to fill the void. In this era of chaos, the people of Sicily found themselves in a state of profound anarchy. There were no local police forces to call upon, no reliable courts to adjudicate land disputes, and no government officials to protect the vulnerable from the lawless. It was into this void that the first true bosses stepped. The mafia did not invent chaos, they mastered the art of managing it. They realized that in a land where the state is an abstraction, power belongs to whoever can provide certainty. If a farmer needed protection from bandits, he turned to the local uomo d'onor. If a merchant needed a dispute settled without waiting months for a corrupt judge in a distant city, he turned to the casca. The Mafia presented themselves not as criminals, but as a shadow government, a parallel state that offered the one thing the new Italy could not: order. They became the mediators, the tax collectors, and the enforcers of a private law. By providing a crude, violent form of stability, they embedded themselves into the very socio-economic fabric of the island. The political instability of the post-unification era meant that the new Italian authorities were often more interested in political maneuvering than in actual governance. This corruption allowed the early mafia families to infiltrate the local administration. They became the bridge between the legitimate world of politics and the illegitimate world of crime. They provided the votes that kept local officials in power, and in exchange, those officials looked the other way. The unification of Italy was supposed to bring the rule of law to Sicily. Instead, it gave birth to a system where the law was secondary to the shadow. The state had arrived, but it had arrived too late and too weak to stop the rise of the bosses. The foundation was laid, a nation unified in name, but a Sicily ruled by the silent, iron grip of the Mafia. 1870, Palermo, Sicily. The vacuum of power had been established, and the shadow government was no longer a mere concept. It was becoming a dynasty. As the new Italian state struggled to assert its presence, the various cache, the local cells of the Mafia, began to coalesce around specific lineages. These were not yet the global syndicates we recognize today, but they were the primordial ancestors of the underworld, the first legendary Sicilian clans. In the rugged hinterlands and the expanding urban centers of Palermo, names began to emerge that would strike fear into the hearts of both the peasantry and the landed elite. These early families were often built upon the foundations of existing social hierarchies. Some rose from the ranks of the Gabelati, the ruthless estate managers who leased land from absentee aristocrats and enforced their will through violence. Others emerged from the rural banditry that had plagued the island for centuries, evolving from mere outlaws into sophisticated brokers of influence. These early clans functioned with a terrifyingly efficient logic. They were not merely gangs of thieves. They were territorial sovereigns. A family's power was measured by its manpower, its ability to command loyalty and exert violence within a specific geographic boundary. In the citrus groves of the Conca d'Oro or the wheat fields of the interior, certain surnames became synonymous with the law itself. To cross a member of an established clan was not merely a criminal offense. It was an act of war against a sovereign entity. The structure of these early families was deeply patriarchal and intensely insular. At the summit sat the capofamiglia, a figure who commanded absolute devotion. Below him were the Sottocapi and Capocina, men who managed the day-to-day operations of extortion, protection, and dispute resolution. This hierarchy ensured that even if a low-level soldier was caught, the upper echelons remained shielded by the very omerta we have discussed. As these clans consolidated, they began to specialize. Some focused on the control of water rights, a life-or-death commodity in the arid Sicilian landscape. Others dominated the burgeoning markets of livestock and grain. Some even began to weave themselves into the local political fabric, acting as the silent architects behind the election of mayors and provincial officials. They were the men of honor who held the keys to the island's economy. But this era of emergence was also an era of brutal consolidation. For a new family to rise, An old one often had to fall. The landscape of Sicily became a patchwork of competing interests, where blood feuds were not just personal vendettas, but strategic maneuvers to expand territory. These early conflicts were the blueprints for the great wars that would follow in the decades to come. By the turn of the century, the blueprint was complete. The Mafia had transitioned from a collection of disorganized rural protectors into a sophisticated network of hereditary clans. They had successfully institutionalized crime, turning it into a tradition passed from father to son. The stage was set. The families were established, the territory was carved up, and the Sicilian clans were ready to expand their reach far beyond the shores of their home island. The roots were deep, the branches were strong, and the world was about to learn the true cost of their shadow. 1890, the port of Palermo, Sicily. The air is thick with the scent of salt, coal smoke, and the desperate sweat of thousands. For many, this is the smell of departure, the final breath of a homeland that has offered nothing but poverty, political corruption, and the suffocating grip of the clans. As the massive steamships prepare to depart for the Americas, they carry more than just laborers seeking a new life. They carry the invisible cargo of the Sicilian soul. And within that soul, tucked deep beneath the layers of tradition and survival, is the DNA of the Cosa Nostra. This was the era of the Great Migration. Between 1880 and the outbreak of the First World War, millions of Italians fled the crushing hardships of the Mediterranean, seeking the promise of the New World. They traveled in steerage, packed into the iron bellies of vessels bound for Ellis Island and the bustling ports of New Orleans. To the American authorities, they were merely a tidal wave of immigrants, an endless stream of peasants, artisans, and dreamers. But to the organized underworld, this migration was something far more profound. It was a transplantation. The Mafia did not travel as a formal army. It traveled in the shadows of the diaspora. It moved through the tight-knit, insular communities that formed in the tenements of East Harlem, the Little Italies of Chicago, and the docks of New Orleans. These immigrants sought to recreate the social structures they had left behind, building mutual aid societies and cultural clubs to protect themselves in a foreign, often hostile land. But where there is a community of outsiders, there is also a vacuum of authority. And where there is a vacuum of authority, the old ways of the Sicilian clans find fertile soil. The men who stepped off those ships were not all victims of circumstance. Among the masses were the seasoned veterans of the Sicilian struggle, men who understood the mechanics of extortion, the utility of violence, and the sacred necessity of omertà. They brought with them a specialized toolkit for survival in a lawless environment. They knew how to navigate the complexities of ethnic enclaves, how to exert influence over labor, and how to build a shadow government that operated parallel to the American state. In the United States, the Mafia encountered a landscape of unprecedented opportunity. The old feudal structures of Sicily were replaced by the explosive, unregulated growth of American capitalism. The traditional rackets of land and water rights were replaced by the burgeoning opportunities of urban corruption, labor unions, and the shadowy fringes of the Industrial Revolution. The men of honor found that the principles of the Casca, loyalty to the blood, absolute silence, and the strategic use of terror, were universal. They were not just adapting to a new world, they were beginning to colonize it. As the ships continued to dock, the seed was planted. The Sicilian Mafia was no longer a local phenomenon confined to a single Mediterranean island. It had become a migratory predator, shedding its old skin to adopt a new, more lucrative form. The transition had begun. The ancient traditions of the Old World were crossing the Atlantic, ready to collide with the chaos of the New, setting the stage for a transformation that would turn small-time immigrant gangs into the most powerful criminal syndicates the world had ever seen. 1920, New York City, USA. The era of the immigrant laborer was fading, and a new, more volatile era was beginning. For decades, the Italian enclaves of America had been sites of struggle, but they were largely peripheral to the American mainstream. The Mafia were street-level operators, small-time extortionists, and neighborhood muscle. They were visible, they were localized, and they were often ignored by the powers that be. But then, a single stroke of a legislative pen changed the trajectory of organized crime forever. In January of 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, followed swiftly by the passage of the Volstead Act. The goal of the temperance movement was noble, if idealistic: to cleanse the nation of the perceived social evils of alcohol, to curb domestic violence, and to heal the fractured morality of a post-war society. But the lawmakers in Washington had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had underestimated the human appetite for drink, and they had vastly underestimated the capacity of the Sicilian underworld to exploit a sudden, massive, and illegal demand. The Volstead Act did not stop the consumption of alcohol. It simply moved the entire industry into the shadows. Overnight, the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol became a federal crime. This created a vacuum of supply that the legitimate economy could no longer fill, but the demand remained as constant as the tide. For the men of honor who had crossed the Atlantic just a generation prior, this was not a moral crisis. It was the greatest economic opportunity in human history. The transition was seismic. The Mafia, which had previously focused on localized rackets like protection and gambling, suddenly found itself at the helm of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. They were no longer just neighborhood thugs. They were become the logistics masters of a national contraband network. To fulfill the demand created by the Volstead Act, the clans had to evolve. They needed sophisticated smuggling routes, high-speed boats to outrun Coast Guard cutters, hidden warehouses, and a massive, corruptible network of police, judges, and politicians. This was the birth of the bootlegger. From the rum-running vessels off the Atlantic coast to the hijacked trucks speeding through the Midwest, the Mafia began to build a shadow infrastructure that rivaled the legitimate corporations of the era. They learned the art of large-scale distribution. They mastered the intricacies of bribery on a grand scale. They realized that if you control the supply of a commodity that everyone wants but no one can legally possess, you don't just control a market, you control the city. The influx of unprecedented wealth acted as a catalyst, accelerating the growth of the various families and fueling a level of violence and ambition never before seen on American soil. The money was intoxicating, flowing in faster than the criminals could launder it. It funded better weapons, more powerful corruption, and more expansive territories. The Volstead Act had intended to dry up the nation, but instead, it provided the liquid capital that allowed the Mafia to drown the American legal system. The small, fragmented gangs of the immigrant era were being forged, in the heat of prohibition, into a monolithic, industrial-strength criminal empire. The era of the street thug was over. The era of the syndicate had begun. 1922. The Atlantic coast and the urban corridors of the American East. If the ratification of the Volstead Act was the spark, then the ensuing years were the wildfire. As the demand for illicit spirits reached a fever pitch, the landscape of American crime shifted from the shadows of back alleys to the vast, open expanses of the coastline and the highways. This was the era of the bootlegger, and with it came a new, more aggressive brand of criminality defined by three pillars: smuggling, hijacking, and the brutal struggle for territory. The first pillar was smuggling, the art of the rum runner. Along the jagged coastlines of New York, New Jersey, and Long Island, the ocean became a liquid highway for contraband. Small, high-speed vessels, often equipped with powerful engines designed for racing, would slip through the fog under the cover of darkness. They met massive mother ships anchored in international waters, vessels laden with premium Scotch, Canadian whiskey, and Caribbean rum. These rum runners were the maritime specialists of the underworld, navigating treacherous waters and outmaneuvering Coast Guard cutters in a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. For the Mafia, these sea routes were more than just paths for booze. They were the lifeblood of a new maritime economy that bypassed every federal checkpoint. But as the supply moved inland, a second, more predatory phenomenon emerged: hijacking. As shipments of alcohol moved from the docks to the urban speakeasies via truck and rail, they became targets of immense value. A single truckload of high-quality whiskey was worth more than a year's wages for a common laborer. This gave rise to the hijackers, gangs of highly mobile, heavily armed crews who specialized in intercepting convoys. They would ambush trucks on lonely stretches of highway or raid warehouses in the dead of night, using brute force and sudden, overwhelming violence. Hijacking wasn't just about theft. It was a disruption of the market. It turned the very act of distribution into a battlefield, where every shipment carried the risk of a bloodbath. This brings us to the third and most volatile pillar: the battle for territory. In the old world, the Mafia's influence was confined to a single neighborhood or a specific village. In the new world of prohibition, the scale had expanded exponentially. A single city, or even a single shipping route, could be worth millions of dollars. This created a zero-sum game. If one clan controlled the docks of Brooklyn, another would attempt to seize the warehouses in New Jersey. If one family held the monopoly on Canadian imports, a rival would attempt to hijack their shipments to break their stranglehold. The boundaries between these criminal empires were not marked by maps, but by blood. To claim territory was to claim the right to tax every drop of alcohol that passed through it. This led to a constant, simmering state of warfare. Small-scale skirmishes between rival crews frequently escalated into full-scale gang wars, fought with Tommy guns and improvised explosives. The streets of New York and Chicago became theaters of urban combat, as different factions fought to establish zones of influence. These conflicts were not merely about greed. They were about the establishment of order. In the chaos of the bootlegging boom, the most successful organizations were those that could most effectively use violence to enforce their dominance. They were learning that to be a true syndicate, one had to do more than just sell a product. One had to control the entire geography of the trade. The struggle for territory was the crucible in which the modern, territorial structure of the American Mafia was being forged. 1930, New York City. As the profits from the bootlegging boom reached astronomical proportions, the friction between the old and the new began to reach a breaking point. The American underworld was no longer a collection of small-time street gangs. It had become a massive, interconnected machine. But this machine was being pulled in two opposing directions by two different philosophies of power. On one side stood the mustache Petes, the old-world traditionalists. These were men born in Sicily, men who clung to the rigid feudal hierarchies of the old country. To them, the Mafia was a brotherhood of honor, governed by strict ethnic lines and absolute deference to the aging dons. They viewed the new, rapid expansion of crime as a vulgar pursuit that lacked respect for the ancient customs. Foremost among them was Giuseppe, Joe the Boss Masseria, a man who ruled through intimidation and a relentless, archaic sense of dominance. On the other side was a rising generation of younger, more pragmatic gangsters. These men, led by figures like Charles Lucky, Luciano, and Vito Genovese, were not interested in the romanticized notions of Sicilian honor or the complex rituals of the old guard. They were businessmen. They saw prohibition not as a disruption to tradition, but as a massive industrial opportunity. To them, the old bosses were an obstacle to efficiency, a bottleneck of ego and outdated superstition that prevented the syndicate from maximizing its profit. They wanted a corporate structure. The old guard wanted a kingdom. The tension finally snapped into open warfare, a conflict that would become known as the Castellamers War. The war was not fought in the open streets like the gangland skirmishes of the previous decade. It was a shadow war of precision strikes, assassinations, and calculated betrayals. It pitted the Masseria faction against the forces of Salvatore Maranzano, a man who claimed descent from the powerful Castellamer del Golfo clan in Sicily. As the two titans clashed, the underworld was split down the middle. Every soldier, every capo, and every bootlegger had to choose a side, and in doing so, they signaled the end of the unified Sicilian tradition in America. The violence was relentless. High-ranking soldiers disappeared in the night. Drive-by shootings became the primary method of political communication. But while the bullets flew, the younger generation was playing a much deeper game. Behind the scenes, Luciano and his associates were quietly negotiating, realizing that as long as the old bosses were at war, the business would suffer. They were waiting for the moment when the bloodletting would reach its zenith, allowing them to step into the vacuum. The war reached its bloody conclusion in 1931. Through a series of strategic hits, the old guard was dismantled. Masseria, realizing the end was near, was gunned down in a restaurant, his death marking the definitive fall of the mustache Petes. Maranzano, believing he had emerged victorious, was assassinated just months later in a hit orchestrated by the very men he thought he had defeated. The Castellamers War was more than just a struggle for control. It was a revolution. It swept away the feudal remnants of the old world and replaced them with something far more dangerous, a streamlined, modernized, and highly organized criminal conglomerate. The era of the individual don was over. The era of the syndicate had begun. 1931, New York City. The smoke from the Castellamers War had barely cleared, leaving the streets of Manhattan stained with the blood of the old guard. With the traditionalist leadership decapitated, a massive power vacuum loomed over the American underworld. But where others saw chaos, Charles Lucky, Luciano saw a blueprint. He did not want to be a king sitting on a throne of ancient customs. He wanted to be the CEO of a global enterprise. Luciano understood a fundamental truth that the mustache Petes had ignored. Constant warfare is bad for business. Internal bloodletting drew the attention of the law, disrupted supply chains, and bled profits dry. To ensure the survival and growth of the syndicate, the Mafia needed to evolve from a collection of warring Sicilian fiefdoms into a coordinated, multi-ethnic corporate entity. The solution was the creation of the Commission. This was not a single throne, but a governing board. The Commission acted as a supreme regulatory body, designed to mediate disputes between families, authorize high-level assassinations, and set the rules for the new American underworld. It was a radical departure from the past. Instead of one supreme boss ruling through divine right or ancestral lineage, power was now distributed among the heads of the most powerful families. This was the birth of the modern Mafia, a decentralized yet highly disciplined syndicate. To solidify this new order, Luciano formalized the structure of the five families of New York. This hierarchy was modeled after a corporate ladder. At the top sat the boss, followed by the underboss, the consigliere, a legalistic advisor, and the caporgimes who managed the soldiers. This structure allowed for a terrifying level of scalability. A soldier could be a street-level enforcer, while his boss operated in the shadows of legitimate industry, both connected by a chain of command that was as efficient as it was ruthless. Crucially, Luciano broke the ultimate taboo. He opened the doors to non-Sicilians. He recognized that the future of organized crime lay in cooperation with other ethnic syndicates, the Jewish mob, the Irish gangs, and various immigrant networks. By moving away from pure Sicilian nationalism and toward a pragmatic, multi-ethnic alliance, Luciano transformed the Mafia from a localized secret society into a national powerhouse. The Commission served as the ultimate stabilizer. If two families clashed over territory in Brooklyn or the control of a waterfront pier, they no longer turned to a street war. They brought their grievances to the board. Decisions were made through negotiation and strategic voting, ensuring that the business remained insulated from the volatility of individual egos. Under Luciano's shadow leadership, the Mafia became an invisible ghost in the American economy. They were no longer just bootleggers. They were infiltrators of labor unions, architects of construction rackets, and masters of the burgeoning narcotics trade. The transition was complete. The Mafia had shed its feudal skin. It had traded the romanticism of the old-world Don for the cold, calculated precision of the modern gangster. The era of honor was dead. The era of the syndicate had arrived, and it was built to last. 1931, New York City. The blueprint was drawn, the commission was formed, and the chaos of the Castellammers War was replaced by a chilling, calculated order. But a corporate structure is nothing without its divisions. To truly dominate the five boroughs, Luciano and his contemporaries had to formalize the boundaries of power. They did this by carving New York into five distinct territories, establishing the five dynasties that would dictate the pulse of the American underworld for decades to come. First, there was the Genovese family. Under the watchful eye of the new regime, they emerged as the most disciplined and secretive of the bunch. They were the masters of the shadow approach, often operating with such discretion that even other mobsters struggled to identify their true leaders. They became the benchmark for stability and quiet influence. Then came the Gambino family. While they would reach their zenith in later decades under the likes of Carlo Gambino, their foundations were laid during this era of restructuring. They were the quintessential powerhouse, wielding immense influence over the docks, the unions, and the very infrastructure of the city. In the shadows of the streets, the Lucchese family carved out a niche of specialized crime. They became the masters of the intricate, handling everything from labor racketeering to sophisticated hijacking schemes. They were the specialists, the ones who understood that a well-placed bribe or a controlled strike could be just as profitable as a gunshot. The Bonanno family represented the soul of the old world. Even as Luciano pushed toward a modern, multi-ethnic future, the Bonannos clung to the traditional Sicilian roots. They were the keepers of the old customs, a family that balanced the cold pragmatism of the new syndicate with a fierce, almost religious adherence to the ancestral codes of the Casca. Finally, there was the Colombo family, often serving as the volatile edge of the New York landscape. They were a family defined by constant movement and internal tension, yet they remained an essential piece of the five-part puzzle that held the city in a stranglehold. This wasn't just a division of territory, it was a division of labor. By establishing these five distinct pillars, the Mafia created a system of checks and balances. Each family had its own business model, its own soldiers, and its own rackets, yet they all answered to the same supreme authority, the Commission. This hierarchy created a terrifying synergy. If a soldier in the Lucchese family stepped on the toes of a Gambino associate, it wasn't a gang war that erupted, it was a boardroom crisis. The conflict was brought to the Commission, mediated, and settled with a signature rather than a massacre. This prevented the street-level violence that so often drew the eyes of the police, allowing the families to grow in the darkness of the city's legal and economic loopholes. The five families had successfully institutionalized crime. They had turned the impulse for violence into a structured, profitable, and remarkably resilient machine. They were no longer mere gangs of immigrants fighting for scraps in the tenements. They were the architects of a shadow government, a silent empire that moved through the veins of New York City, untouchable, organized, and absolute. The stage was set for the golden age of the dawn. July 1943, Sicily. The structured, corporate order that Lucky Luciano had painstakingly built in New York was about to face its greatest test, not from a rival gang or a federal prosecutor, but from the fires of global warfare. As the smoke of the Second World War drifted across the Mediterranean, the eyes of the world were fixed on the Mediterranean theater. The Allies were preparing Operation Husky, the massive, amphibious invasion of Sicily. To the world, this was a crusade for liberation. To the American Mafia, it was an opportunity for a profound and highly controversial homecoming. For over a decade, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra had been suppressed. The rise of Benito Mussolini and his fascist regime had been a death sentence for the traditional mafia. Mussolini viewed the men of honor as a threat to the state's absolute authority, launching a brutal crackdown that drove the bosses underground, imprisoned them, or forced them into exile. The old Sicilian structures were fractured, their influence broken by the iron fist of the blackshirts. But as the Allied forces prepared to storm the beaches of Sicily, a strange and clandestine synergy began to emerge between the American syndicate and the military intelligence of the United States. The logic was as pragmatic as it was morally gray. The Allies needed to govern a hostile, occupied territory with minimal manpower. They needed local leaders who could maintain order, secure the food supply, and keep the population compliant. The Office of Naval Intelligence, working alongside the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, realized that the people best suited for this task were not the local politicians, many of whom were fascist sympathizers, but the very men the Americans had helped build in the New York underworld. Enter the lucky connection. While Luciano himself was behind bars at the time, his lieutenants and associates were moving in the same circles as high-ranking military officials. The theory was simple. The men who understood the Sicilian social fabric, the men who spoke the language of omerta and understood the complex hierarchy of the Casca, could act as a bridge between the liberating armies and the Sicilian people. In the chaos following the invasion, the lines between liberator and criminal became dangerously blurred. As the Allied forces moved inland, they found themselves relying on local administrators to manage towns and distribute resources. In many cases, these administrators were nothing more than old-world mafia bosses who had been waiting in the shadows for the fascists to fall. The result was a political resurrection. The vacuum left by the retreating fascists was not filled by democracy, but by the returning shadows. The Mafia used the Allied invasion as a vehicle for reinvention. They transitioned from being hunted outlaws to being indispensable local power brokers. They provided stability to the occupiers, and in exchange, they were granted a new, untouchable legitimacy. The shadow of the war had provided the perfect camouflage. Under the guise of wartime necessity, the Sicilian Mafia reclaimed its territory, re-established its connections to the American families, and prepared to enter a new, even more lucrative era of influence. The war was ending, but for the Cosa Nostra, the real conquest was just beginning. 1946, New York City. The guns of Europe had fallen silent, and as the soldiers returned home, a new kind of warfare began. One fought not with artillery, but with concrete, steel, and the subtle, suffocating grip of the Union card. The American Mafia had survived the chaos of the war, and they emerged with a new, singular objective: legitimacy through infiltration. They no longer wanted to just run the streets. They wanted to own the very infrastructure of the American dream. The post-war era was defined by an unprecedented economic explosion. The United States was undergoing a massive transformation. Suburbs were sprawling into the countryside. Skyscrapers were piercing the skyline, and the nation was hungry for growth. This era of unprecedented construction provided the perfect landscape for the syndicate to plant its roots. The key to this conquest lay in the labor unions. In the 1940s and 50s, unions held immense power over the American economy. They controlled the men, the machines, and the timelines of every major project. For the five families, infiltrating these unions was the ultimate strategic masterstroke. By placing made men or their associates in key leadership positions within the Teamsters, the International Longshoremen's Association, and various construction trades, the Mafia achieved something far more potent than simple extortion. They achieved control over the supply chain. If a construction company refused to pay protection, a strike would suddenly materialize. If they didn't cooperate, their materials would disappear from the docks, or their equipment would be sabotaged. They didn't need to rob a bank when they could simply tax every brick laid and every ton of steel hoisted. The Mafia had turned the labor movement into a toll booth on the road to progress. This influence flowed directly into the construction industry itself. Through rigged bidding processes and sweetheart deals between corrupt union bosses and mob-controlled contractors, the syndicate became a silent partner in the building of modern America. They controlled the concrete, they controlled the unions, and they controlled the sites. They were no longer just thugs in back alleys. They were the invisible architects of the skyline. But the infiltration didn't stop at the rising steel beams. As the cities grew, so did the waste they produced. This led the Mafia to another goldmine: waste management. The garbage industry was a perfect ecosystem for organized crime. It was a fragmented, labor-intensive business that operated in the shadows of the city's periphery. By controlling the sanitation unions and the private hauling companies, the mob gained a stranglehold on the very cleanliness of the urban environment. In many American cities, the trash collection became a monopoly enforced by the threat of violence. If a private company tried to compete, they faced hijacked trucks, broken equipment, or accidental fires. In exchange for a cut of the profits, the mob ensured that the strikes stayed away and the trucks kept moving. It was a clean business in the most literal sense, masking a profoundly dirty reality. By the mid-1950s, the transformation was complete. The Mafia had successfully pivoted from the high-risk, high-visibility world of bootlegging to the low-profile, high-reward world of legitimate industry. They had moved from the fringes of society into its very foundation. They were no longer just hiding from the law. They were woven into the very fabric of the American economy, hiding in plain sight behind union seals, construction permits, and the hum of the garbage truck. 1954, Havana, Cuba. As the syndicate tightened its grip on the concrete and steel of the American skyline, its gaze began to drift southward, toward the warm, turquoise waters of the Caribbean. If the United States was the engine of the Mafia's legitimate expansion, Cuba was to be its playground, a lawless, neon-soaked paradise where the rules of the American mainland seemed to evaporate in the tropical heat. To the American mob, Havana was not just a vacation destination. It was a strategic offshore sanctuary. It was a place where the vast wealth generated by the labor unions and construction rackets could be laundered, and where the most lucrative, high-risk vices could be operated with a degree of freedom that the FBI would never permit on American soil. The architecture of this empire was built on a foundation of corruption. Under the regime of Fulgencio Batista, the line between the Cuban government and the American underworld became almost non-existent. For the right price, Havana became a sovereign state for the syndicate. High-ranking officials were on the payroll, ensuring that the Mafia's interests were protected by the very people sworn to uphold the law. The centerpiece of this empire was the casino. In the glittering halls of the Hotel National and the sprawling resorts of Vedado, the mob found its ultimate revenue stream. These weren't merely gambling dens. They were sophisticated money laundering machines. The massive influx of cash from illegal gambling, combined with the burgeoning tourism industry, allowed the five families to move millions of dollars across borders with terrifying ease. But the casinos were only the tip of the iceberg. Havana became a global hub for the vice economy. The docks were teeming with illicit goods, and the nightlife was fueled by a cocktail of unregulated narcotics, prostitution, and high-stakes theft. For men like Mayor Lansky, the architect of the Havana operation, the island represented the perfection of the criminal model, a seamless integration of organized crime, legitimate hospitality, and state-sponsored complicity. The Mafia's presence in Cuba was also a logistical masterstroke. The island served as a perfect staging ground for international operations. From the ports of Havana, the syndicate could oversee the movement of contraband throughout the Caribbean and into the American South, bypassing the traditional scrutiny of U.S. customs. It was a shadow kingdom, operating in the sun, far from the watchful eyes of the New York detectives. For a few golden years, the Mafia truly reigned supreme in the tropics. The streets of Havana hummed with a decadent energy, a fever dream of excess fueled by mob profits. The bosses lived like kings, moving between their penthouses in Manhattan and their villas in Cuba, presiding over a transnational empire that spanned two nations. However, this paradise was built on shifting sands. The very corruption that allowed the Mafia to flourish was sowing the seeds of its own destruction. While the syndicate was busy counting its casino chips, a revolutionary fire was spreading through the Cuban countryside. A young doctor named Fidel Castro was gathering momentum, and his vision for a new Cuba had no room for the American gangsters who had turned his country into a private playground. The era of the Havana Connection was reaching its crescendo, but the shadow of the revolution was already beginning to fall across the bright lights of the casinos. 1959, Havana, Cuba. The revolution did not just bring a change in government, it brought a total collapse of the Mafia's Caribbean sanctuary. As Fidel Castro's forces seized control, the neon lights of Havana went dark for the syndicate. The casinos were nationalized, the offshore bank accounts were frozen, and the American bosses were forced into a frantic, humiliating retreat. The loss of Cuba was more than just a blow to the ego of the Commission. It was a massive financial vacuum. For decades, the mob had thrived on the predictable, high-margin profits of gambling and the dying echoes of the Prohibition-era's bootlegging. But the world was changing, and the old avenues of revenue were drying up. The syndicate faced a crossroads: adapt or wither. As the 1960s dawned, a new, far more lethal commodity began to emerge on the global stage. While the old guard of the Mafia viewed narcotics with a certain traditionalist disdain, seeing them as dirty business that drew too much heat from the federal government, a new breed of criminal was looking toward the east. They saw an opportunity that dwarfed the profits of any casino or construction racket. The transition was not an overnight pivot, but a calculated, bloody evolution. It began with the realization that the same logistical networks used to smuggle cigarettes and alcohol could be repurposed for something much more potent. The target was heroin. The supply chain was a masterpiece of transnational criminal cooperation. It started in the Golden Crescent, the rugged borderlands of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, where raw opium was harvested in vast quantities. From there, the product moved through the sophisticated laboratories of Turkey and the Middle East, where it was refined into high-grade white powder. But a product is nothing without a pipeline. This is where the Mafia's expertise in smuggling and territorial control became indispensable. The syndicate began to forge unspoken alliances with overseas suppliers, creating a bridge between the ancient opium fields and the urban centers of the West. They utilized the same shipping lanes, the same corrupt dockworkers, and the same deceptive front companies that had served them during the days of rum running. However, this shift ignited a fundamental internal conflict. To the traditionalists, like the aging bosses of the five families, drugs were a no-go zone, a volatile business that invited the full, unbridled wrath of the newly empowered DEA and the FBI. They feared that the narcotics taint would destroy the respectability they had worked so hard to cultivate through labor unions and legitimate businesses. But the young Turks, the ambitious, mid-level capos and street soldiers, saw it differently. They saw the sheer, astronomical scale of the profit margins. They saw a way to bypass the slow, incremental gains of the construction industry for the instant, overwhelming wealth of the drug trade. The tension between the old code of traditional crime and the new reality of the narcotics era would become the fault line of the underworld. As the heroin began to flow through the ports of New York and the streets of Philadelphia, it would do more than just fill the mafia's coffers. It would trigger a cycle of violence, paranoia, and federal scrutiny that would eventually lead to the very downfall of the commission itself. The transition was complete. The era of the gentleman gangster was dying, and the era of the drug lord had begun. 1960, Marseille, France. If the Golden Crescent provided the raw material, and the Middle East provided the refinement, then the Mediterranean coast of France provided the gateway. As the mafia's traditional revenue streams in the Americas began to face unprecedented pressure, a sophisticated, multi-continental bridge emerged, earning a name that would strike fear into the hearts of DEA agents for decades: the French Connection. This was not the work of disorganized street gangs or impulsive smugglers. This was a high-level, logistical masterpiece orchestrated by a convergence of interests. On one end of the pipeline were the Corsican syndicates, the Corsican mob, who controlled the docks and the underworld of Marseille. They were the masters of the Mediterranean, seasoned in the art of smuggling and possessed of a deep-seated distrust of central authority. On the other end were the American Cosa Nostra families, specifically the five families of New York, who possessed the distribution networks and the desperate hunger for high-margin narcotics. The connection functioned like a well-oiled machine. The process began with the bulk shipment of morphine base, often sourced from the Levant, arriving in the bustling, sun-drenched ports of southern France. In the hidden laboratories tucked away in the hills surrounding Marseille, Corsican chemists, some of the most skilled in the world, would perform the delicate, dangerous work of converting that base into pure, uncut heroin. This was Marseille White, a product so potent and so refined that it became the gold standard for the American market. Once the product was processed, the logistics shifted from chemistry to maritime deception. The heroin was packed into seemingly innocuous shipments, crates of olive oil, shipments of textiles, or even hidden within the very hulls of commercial vessels. The Corsican syndicates used their influence over port unions to ensure that these shipments moved through customs with minimal scrutiny, often aided by a web of bribed officials and corrupted dockworkers. From the French coast, the deadly cargo would cross the Atlantic. It traveled via merchant ships and clandestine flights, landing in the major hubs of the American East Coast: New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Here, the handoff occurred. The Corsican suppliers would meet with American distributors, often in neutral territories or through layers of intermediaries, to ensure that if one link in the chain was broken, the entire structure wouldn't collapse. This international pipeline transformed the Mafia from a domestic criminal entity into a global logistical powerhouse. The sheer volume of wealth flowing through the French Connection was staggering. It allowed the Young Turks within the American families to amass fortunes that could rival legitimate corporations. It funded more sophisticated weaponry, more corrupt politicians, and more expansive criminal enterprises. But this prosperity came with a catastrophic price. The French Connection turned the war on organized crime into a global pursuit. It forced the United States to move beyond local policing and into the realm of international intelligence and specialized task forces. The scale of the trade meant that the Mafia was no longer just fighting the FBI. They were fighting a globalized law enforcement response. The very pipeline that brought them unimaginable wealth was also carving a path straight to their doorstep. bringing with it the unrelenting heat of a federal government that could no longer ignore the poison flowing through its veins. 1972, New York City. While the French Connection was fueling a global heroin empire, a different kind of storm was brewing within the very heart of the American Cosa Nostra. The unprecedented wealth flowing from the narcotics trade hadn't just brought power, it had brought a fundamental shift in the criminal psyche. For decades, the Mafia had operated under a rigid, almost feudal hierarchy. At the top sat the old guard, men who had been raised on the traditions of the Sicilian countryside. To them, the Mafia was a brotherhood of honor, built on a foundation of respect, cautious negotiation, and a strict adherence to the old ways. They viewed themselves as businessmen of the underworld, preferring the steady, predictable profits of labor racketeering, construction skimming, and gambling. To the old guard, drugs were a dirty business. They believed that narcotics brought too much heat, unwanted, unrelenting attention from the FBI and the DEA that threatened the stability of the entire syndicate. They feared that the volatile, high-stakes nature of the heroin trade would invite a level of federal scrutiny that no amount of bribery could suppress. For these traditionalists, the Code of Omerta was not just about silence. It was about maintaining a certain dignity and social order within the underworld. But a new breed of criminal was rising through the ranks, fueled by the very shipments described in the Marseille pipelines. These were the Young Turks. They were the sons of immigrants and the proteges of the post-war era. They were faster, more aggressive, and significantly more ruthless. To the Young Turks, the old guard's obsession with honor and tradition looked less like dignity and more like obsolescence. They saw the old bosses sitting in social clubs, sipping espresso and discussing the good old days, while millions of dollars in untraceable heroin cash passed through the streets just blocks away. The Young Turks didn't care about the social standing of the family or the subtle nuances of Sicilian etiquette. They were capitalists of the gutter. They saw the drug trade not as a liability, but as the ultimate frontier of profit. They were impatient, driven by a modern, cutthroat ambition that prioritized rapid expansion and massive, immediate returns over long-term stability. They were willing to embrace the violence, the chaos, and the federal heat if it meant securing a seat at the table of the new, globalized criminal economy. This was more than just a disagreement over business strategy. It was a fundamental clash of identities. The tension began to manifest in the shadows of social clubs and the backrooms of legitimate businesses. It was felt in the way meetings were conducted, in the growing disrespect shown to senior capos, and in the blatant disregard for the Commission's traditional decrees. The old guard looked at the Young Turks and saw nothing but reckless, undisciplined thugs who would burn the whole house down for a quick payday. The Young Turks looked at the old guard and saw dinosaurs, relics of a bygone era who were standing in the way of progress. As the heroin money continued to pour in, the cracks in the foundation of the five families began to widen. The question was no longer if a confrontation would occur, but whether the Mafia would survive the inevitable explosion when these two incompatible worlds finally collided. 1975, New York City. The tension that had been simmering in the social clubs of East Harlem and South Brooklyn was no longer a quiet discomfort. It had become a structural fracture. The heroin money had changed the math of organized crime. In the old days, wealth was measured in the slow, steady accumulation of tribute from local rackets. But the narcotics trade offered a scale of profit that was vertical, exponential, and most importantly, decentralized. This shift in capital triggered a shift in the hierarchy. Traditionally, the caporgime, or capo, acted as a buffer, a middle manager who took orders from the boss and distributed them to the soldiers. They were meant to be the loyal lieutenants of the family, the bridge between the untouchable leadership and the street-level muscle. But as the drug billions began to circulate, the capos realized something profound. They were the ones actually controlling the product, managing the distributors, and handling the liquid cash. They were the ones with their hands on the pulse of the new economy. For many of these mid-level managers, the old guard bosses were becoming more than just outdated. They were becoming an expensive bottleneck. The bosses sat atop the hierarchy, collecting massive tribute or percentages of every transaction, yet they often provided little more than a name and a sense of tradition. To a hungry, high-earning capo, the boss was a tax on his success. The rebellion began with the skimming of profits. It started small, a shipment of narcotics reported as lost, or a street-level deal that never made it into the official books. This was the first sign of the capos' growing autonomy. They were testing the waters, seeing how much they could divert before the higher-ups noticed. But as the wealth grew, so did the audacity. The defiance soon moved from the ledgers to the leadership. The capos began to form their own informal networks, bypassing the commission to strike side deals with rival families or international suppliers. They were building their own shadow hierarchies, loyal not to a storied family name, but to the flow of the cash. This was the birth of the management class of the Mafia, men who viewed the traditional structure not as a sacred bond, but as a corporate ladder to be climbed, or a ceiling to be broken. The psychological shift was complete. The traditional concept of the Don as a paternal, wise figurehead was being replaced by a more mercenary reality. The capos were no longer content to be the hands of the boss. They wanted to be the architects of their own empires. They began to cultivate their own loyalists among the soldiers, creating micro-factions within the five families. This internal fragmentation turned the Mafia into a house divided against itself. Every decision made by the Commission was now met with subtle resistance, or outright defiance, from the men who actually ran the streets. The hierarchy was being hollowed out from the middle. The very men tasked with maintaining the order of the families were now the ones most incentivized to dismantle it. As the mid-level management grew more powerful, the era of the absolute boss was drawing to a close, replaced by a volatile era of internal power struggles, where the only thing that truly commanded respect was the strength of one's pocketbook and the speed of one's violence. November 1985. Manhattan, New York. While the five families were busy cannibalizing themselves from the inside, a different kind of predator was circling the periphery of their empire. For decades, the American Mafia had operated under a fundamental assumption that they were a law unto themselves. They believed that as long as they kept their violence contained within their own ranks and avoided direct, large-scale confrontations with the state, they could exist as a shadow government, untouchable and invisible. But they had underestimated a new breed of federal prosecutor, and they had fundamentally misunderstood a new weapon in the government's arsenal. Enter Rudy Giuliani. As the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Giuliani wasn't just looking to bust drug dealers or hijackers. He was looking to decapitate the beast itself. He understood that the Mafia's greatest strength, its rigid hierarchical structure, was also its greatest vulnerability. If you could prove that the bosses were responsible for the crimes of their soldiers, the entire pyramid would collapse. To do this, the Department of Justice leaned heavily on a piece of legislation that had been passed years earlier but had yet to be truly weaponized. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. Before RICO, law enforcement had to catch a mobster in the act of a specific crime, a murder, a bribe, a robbery. But by then, the high-level bosses were long gone, insulated by layers of bureaucracy and the code of silence. They were the architects, never the laborers. RICO changed the math. It allowed prosecutors to charge an entire organization as a criminal enterprise. Under RICO, the government didn't need to prove that a boss pulled a trigger. They only had to prove that he ran an organization that engaged in a pattern of racketeering. It turned the hierarchy against itself. It transformed the commission, the very body created by Lucky Luciano to maintain order, into a roadmap for prosecution. In late 1985, the siege began. The indictment was staggering in its scale. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a blueprint of the underworld. The Department of Justice laid out charges against the heads of the 5 families, alleging that they sat at a commission to mediate disputes, authorize murders, and manage the illegal economy of New York City. For the first time in history, the untouchable leadership was being dragged into the light of a public courtroom. The trial was a media circus, a high-stakes collision between the old-world traditions of omerta and the modern, aggressive machinery of the American legal system. The streets of New York held their breath. This wasn't just another mob trial. This was an existential threat. The prosecution was betting everything on the idea that the Mafia structure was its Achilles heel. As the courtroom doors swung open, the era of the untouchable Don faced its reckoning. The DOJ wasn't just looking for convictions. They were looking to prove that the Mafia was not a fraternity of honor, but a criminal corporation. And as the first witnesses took the stand, the siege of the 5 families had officially begun. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, the bosses realized that the shadow they had lived in for a century was about to be burned away by the light of federal law. 1986, Manhattan, New York. The atmosphere inside the federal courthouse was suffocating, thick with the tension of a world about to be dismantled. This was the commission trial, the largest criminal prosecution in the history of the United States. For the first time, the defendants weren't just street-level enforcers or mid-level capos. They were the kings. The bosses of the Genovese, the Lucchese, the Colombo, the Gambino, and the Bonanno families sat side by side. A gathering of titans that, until this moment, had seemed invincible. But the prosecution was playing a game the Mafia had never seen before. They weren't playing checkers. They were playing a game of systemic destruction. The genius and the terror of the RICO Act lay in its ability to bridge the gap between the crime and the command. Traditionally, a boss could simply shrug off a murder committed by a soldier, claiming he had no knowledge of the hit. He was the ghost in the machine. But RICO stripped away that anonymity. It introduced the concept of the enterprise. By defining the Mafia not as a collection of individuals, but as a singular, continuous criminal entity, the law allowed prosecutors to tie the blood on a street corner directly to the mahogany desk in a social club. Under the shadow of RICO, the very loyalty that the Mafia prized above all else became its undoing. The law created a devastating incentive structure. If you were caught in a RICO indictment, you weren't just looking at a few years for a single robbery. You were looking at decades, perhaps life, in a federal penitentiary. The math had changed. The risk of silence was now higher than the risk of betrayal. This realization sent a tremor through the foundations of Cosa Nostra. The code of silence, omerta, was a psychological shield, but it was no match for the cold, hard reality of federal sentencing guidelines. The government wasn't just looking for evidence, they were looking for cracks, and they found them. As the trial progressed, the prosecution's strategy began to yield its most lethal fruit. They weren't just presenting forensic evidence, they were presenting people. The RICO Act had turned the Mafia's soldiers into its most dangerous witnesses. Men who had once sworn eternal loyalty to their bosses began to realize that the only way to survive the new legal reality was to cooperate. The turncoat was no longer a myth, it was a survival strategy. When high-ranking members began to take the stand, describing the inner workings of the commission, the myth of the honorable society evaporated in real time. They spoke of the orders given, the territories carved up, and the lives traded like commodities. The prosecution was successfully painting the Mafia not as a brotherhood, but as a corporate conglomerate of crime. By the time the verdicts were read, the landscape of American organized crime had been irrevocably altered. The commission trial resulted in massive convictions that effectively decapitated the leadership of the five families. The heads were gone. The structure was shattered. While the families would attempt to regroup, the era of the absolute, unquestioned boss was over. The RICO Act hadn't just prosecuted a crime, it had dismantled a way of life. The backbone of the American Mafia had been snapped, leaving the once mighty syndicate to limp into a new, much more fractured and uncertain era. 1987, Brooklyn, New York. While the commission trial had decapitated the leadership of the five families, one man remained standing, seemingly untouched by the storm of RICO and the wave of informants. He was John Gotti, the flamboyant, sharp-tongued boss of the Gambino crime family. To the public, he was a celebrity. To the FBI, he was the ultimate prize. But to the legal system, he was something far more frustrating: the Teflon Don. Gotti did not lead like the shadowy, reclusive bosses of the past. He was a man of theater. With his perfectly tailored Brioni suits, his manicured hair, and his ability to charm even the most hardened journalists, he transformed the image of a mafia boss from a ghost in the shadows to a media sensation. He walked into courtrooms not with a bowed head, but with a swagger, often flashing a defiant grin at the cameras, projecting an aura of absolute invincibility. The nickname Teflon Don wasn't just a media invention, it was a reflection of a staggering reality. For years, Gotti moved through a minefield of federal indictments, racketeering charges, and murder investigations, only to see them slide off him like water off a non-stick pan. He was a master of the courtroom spectacle, using his charisma to sway juries and his connections to intimidate the process. Every time the Department of Justice thought they had him cornered, a witness would vanish, a piece of evidence would be suppressed, or a jury would return a not guilty verdict. It seemed as though Gotti had mastered a way to exist above the law, a king who could command the very mechanics of justice to fail him. But the problem with Teflon is that it is not a shield, it is merely a coating. And underneath that coating, the friction of the law was beginning to generate heat. The very thing that made Gotti a legend, his visibility, was becoming his greatest liability. In his quest for fame and his refusal to operate in the shadows, he had broken the most fundamental rule of the Cosa Nostra: discretion. The FBI, frustrated by his repeated acquittals, shifted their strategy. They realized they couldn't catch him through the traditional means of street-level surveillance or intercepted phone calls. They needed to penetrate the one thing Gotti relied on most: his inner circle. The cracks began to appear not in his legal defense, but in his personal loyalties. The government began to leverage the same terrifying math that had broken the commission, the threat of life in prison. They targeted the men closest to him, the ones who saw the man behind the persona. The end did not come with a cinematic shootout or a grand courtroom victory. It came through the slow, agonizing erosion of his support. When his closest confidant, Sammy, the bull Gravano, decided that the cost of loyalty was too high, the Teflon finally stripped away. The man who had survived a dozen trials found himself staring at a reality that no amount of charisma could charm away. The rise of John Gotti had been a masterclass in criminal celebrity, but his fall would serve as a grim reminder. In the eyes of the federal government, no one, not even a Don, is truly untouchable. 1981. Palermo, Sicily. While the American Cosa Nostra was struggling to maintain its veneer of celebrity and control under the pressure of Rico, the Sicilian Mafia was descending into a state of absolute primal chaos. If John Gotti was a man of theater and charisma, the men rising to power in Sicily were men of pure, unadulterated terror. This was the era of the Corleonesi. To understand the bloodshed that was about to engulf the island, one must understand the men behind the name. Emerging from the rugged, unforgiving hills of the Corleone district, this faction was led by Salvatore Toto Riina, a man known as the Beast. Unlike the old guard bosses who sought a delicate balance of power and political influence, Riina and his lieutenants, including Bernardo Provenzano, had no interest in diplomacy. They were practitioners of total war. The Corleonesi had spent decades playing a long, patient game, infiltrating other families and quietly replacing their leadership with loyalists. But in the early 1980s, they decided to stop playing from the shadows and began a campaign of systematic extermination. They didn't just want to lead the mafia, they wanted to liquidate anyone who stood in their way. The Second Mafia War was not a conflict of territory or drug routes. It was a purge. The Corleonesi launched a blitzkrieg against the established Palermo families. High-ranking bosses, respected capos, and even their own allies were being gunned down in broad daylight. The streets of Palermo, once a place of structured criminal hierarchy, became a slaughterhouse. The traditional rules of honor and respect were discarded in favor of a scorched earth policy. If a man refused to bow to the Corleonesi, he was dead. If his family stood in the way, they were dead. The violence reached a fever pitch that shocked even the most hardened criminals. It wasn't just the hits on the bosses. It was the indiscriminate nature of the carnage. The Corleonesi were willing to kill anyone, police officers, judges, politicians, and even innocent bystanders, to maintain their grip on the island. They were attempting to turn Sicily into a private fiefdom, a state within a state, where the only law was the whim of Toto Riina. This period of Sicilian bloodshed represented a fundamental shift in the DNA of organized crime. The mafia was moving away from the shadowy syndicate model and toward a paramilitary insurgency. The Corleonesi weren't just criminals. They were insurgents fighting a war against the very concept of the Italian state. But this level of unchecked brutality carried a fatal flaw. By making the mafia a public enemy through extreme, visible violence, the Corleonesi inadvertently forced the hand of the Italian government. They had pushed the state into a corner, leaving the authorities with no choice but to respond with overwhelming force. The era of the untouchable boss was being challenged not just by lawyers and informants, but by a nation that had finally reached its breaking point. As the bodies piled up in the streets of Palermo, the foundation of the Cosa Nostra was cracking. The Corleonesi had achieved total dominance, but in doing so, they had ignited a fire that would eventually consume them. The war for Sicily had begun, and it would be written in blood. 1984. Palermo, Sicily. For years, the Code of Omerta, the sacred vow of silence, had been the unbreakable spine of the Cosa Nostra. To speak to the police was not merely a betrayal of a criminal organization. It was a betrayal of one's blood, one's soul, and one's very identity. But as the Corleonesi turned the streets of Sicily into a graveyard, that spine began to snap. The terror that Toto Riina had unleashed to consolidate power was so absolute, so indiscriminate, that it began to produce an unexpected side effect. Fear of the Mafia had finally surpassed the fear of the law. The cracks in the wall of silence first appeared not with street thugs, but with the men who knew the most. These were the high-ranking officers, the soldiers, and the capos who had once been the most loyal instruments of the syndicate. They saw that the honor they had been promised was a lie, and that the protection the Mafia offered was nothing more than a death sentence. The first major tremor came from within the upper echelons of the Sicilian hierarchy. Tommaso Bassetta, a man once considered one of the most powerful and respected bosses in the Palermo underworld, did something that had been unthinkable for a century. He broke. Bassetta's decision to become a pentito, a repentant, was not born of a sudden moral awakening, but of a cold, calculated realization. He had watched Riina's Corleonesi faction systematically murder his brothers, his sons, and his allies. He realized that in the new Mafia there was no room for the old rules, no respect for the hierarchy, and no safety for anyone. When Bassetta sat down in a sterile interrogation room and began to speak, he didn't just provide names, he provided a map. He provided the DNA of the organization. He explained the structure, the rituals, the connections between families, and most importantly, he identified the monsters running the show. Bassetta's defection acted like a dam breaking. Once the myth of the unbreakable silence was shattered by a man of his stature, the floodgates opened. A wave of high-ranking turncoats began to emerge from the shadows. These weren't just low-level criminals looking for a shorter sentence. These were men who understood the inner workings of the commission. They were the architects of the system, now turning their expertise against the very empire they helped build. This was a psychological earthquake. For the first time in history, the state wasn't just chasing shadows. They were being handed the keys to the kingdom. The informants were providing a level of intelligence that law enforcement had only dreamed of during the Prohibition era or the early days of the American mob. They were testifying to the existence of the commission, describing the secret meetings, and detailing the specific orders given for the most heinous assassinations. The Corleonesi had tried to build a fortress of blood, believing that terror would keep them safe. Instead, they had created an environment where the only way to survive was to betray them. The turning point had arrived. The Mafia was no longer a monolithic, silent entity. It was a leaking vessel, and the state, armed with the testimonies of the men who once ruled the underworld, was finally ready to sink it. 1986. New York City, USA. While Sicily was drowning in a sea of blood and betrayal, a different, more methodical siege was being laid against the American Cosa Nostra. For decades, the bosses of the five families had moved through the world like gods, untouchable, invisible, and seemingly immune to the reach of the law. They operated under the delusion that they were a shadow government, a sovereign entity that existed above the statutes of the United States. But the myth of the untouchable Don was about to collide with the cold, hard reality of a new kind of justice. The weapon of choice was not a bullet, but a piece of legislation, the RICO Act. For years, prosecutors had struggled to take down the Mafia because they could only arrest the men holding the guns, not the men pulling the strings. But the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act changed the rules of engagement. It allowed the Department of Justice to link the street-level crimes of soldiers directly to the commands of the bosses. It turned the very structure of the Mafia, its hierarchy, its loyalty, its chain of command, into its greatest legal liability. The hammer fell in the mid-1980s with the commission trial. In a courtroom that felt more like a battlefield, federal prosecutors, led by the relentless Rudy Giuliani, used the testimonies of former associates to peel back the layers of the syndicate. They didn't just show jury members a series of crimes. They showed them a corporation of murder. They proved that the commission wasn't just a concept, but a functioning board of directors that sanctioned hits, controlled unions, and dictated the flow of millions of dollars. One by one, the titans of the underworld, men who had once been feared as kings, were being led away in handcuffs. The psychological impact was devastating. The Teflon Don, John Gotti, had become a celebrity, a man who seemed to slip through every legal net with a grin and a swagger. His ability to evade conviction had given the Mafia a false sense of invincibility. But as the RICO prosecutions intensified, even the most charismatic figures found that the walls were closing in. The era of the boss as a folk hero was dying, replaced by the image of the boss as a common defendant, stripped of his mystique, and facing the grim reality of life behind bars. As the 1990s approached, the landscape of organized crime had been irrevocably altered. The kings had been dethroned. The absolute authority of the commission was shattered, and the centralized power that had made the Mafia a global force was fracturing into smaller, more desperate factions. The massive, coordinated strikes against the families had turned the underworld into a place of paranoia. When the men at the top can no longer guarantee the safety of their subordinates, and when the law can finally reach the throne, the empire begins to crumble. The era of the untouchable boss had ended. The Mafia had survived for centuries through silence and strength, but it could not survive the combined weight of a sophisticated legal system and the crumbling of its own internal code. The kings were falling, not because they were outgunned, but because they were finally being seen for what they truly were: men, bound by laws they could no longer outrun. 1986, Palermo, Sicily. While the American Mafia was being dismantled by the methodical precision of the RICO Act, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra was engaged in a far more visceral, primal struggle for survival. In the sun-drenched streets of Palermo, the war was not being fought in quiet federal courtrooms, but in the shadows of alleyways and the smoke of car bombings. The Corleone clan, led by the ruthless Salvatore Riina, had risen to power through a campaign of unprecedented savagery, turning Sicily into a battlefield where the state and the Mafia were locked in a death struggle. For decades, the Sicilian Mafia had operated with a sense of impunity that bordered on the divine. They were not merely criminals, they were a parallel state, a shadow administration that dictated the lives of citizens through a mixture of profound respect and paralyzing terror. To the public, they were an inevitable force of nature. To the law, they were an impenetrable fortress of omerta. But in the mid-1980s, that fortress was about to face its greatest siege: the Maxi trial. This was not just another criminal prosecution. It was a structural assault on the very concept of the mafia. For the first time in history, the Italian state, led by the visionary and uncompromising prosecutors Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, sought to do more than just arrest individual gunmen. They aimed to prove that the mafia was not a collection of disconnected gangs, but a single, unified, and highly organized entity. The scale of the trial was staggering. Held in a specially constructed, high-security bunker courtroom within the walls of a Palermo prison, the Maxi trial brought together 475 defendants. It was a legal undertaking of such magnitude that it felt less like a trial and more like a reckoning. The prosecution's strategy was revolutionary. They didn't rely solely on physical evidence, which the mafia could easily intimidate or destroy. Instead, they relied on the most dangerous weapon of all, the pentiti. The pentiti, the turncoats, were the cracks in the Sicilian armor. Men like Tommaso Buscetta, once a high-ranking member of the Sicilian hierarchy, broke the sacred code of silence. Buscetta didn't just provide names, he provided the map. He explained the architecture of Cosa Nostra, the hierarchy of bosses, underbosses, and soldiers, the rituals of initiation, and the logic of the commission. Through his testimony, the invisible structure of the mafia was suddenly laid bare before the world. The prosecution used this intelligence to link hundreds of individual crimes to a centralized command structure. As the trial progressed, the world watched in a mixture of awe and dread. The defendants sat in the dock, a sea of stone-faced men, some projecting an air of defiance, others a simmering rage. They were witnessing the unraveling of a centuries-old myth. The Maxi trial was stripping away the romanticism of men of honor and replacing it with the grim reality of a criminal enterprise that functioned through systemic violence and corruption. When the verdict finally arrived in December 1987, it sent shockwaves through the foundations of Italy. Hundreds of convictions were handed down, including life sentences for the most notorious bosses. It was a monumental victory for the rule of law, a signal to the world that the Sicilian mafia was no longer a sovereign power. But as the gavel fell, the air in Sicily grew heavy. The state had won a historic battle, but in doing so, it had declared war on a cornered predator. And a cornered predator is at its most lethal. May 23, 1992. Capaci, Sicily. The victory of the Maxi trial had been a triumph of justice, but for the Corleonesi, it was an existential declaration of war. Salvatore Riina, the Beast, did not respond to the law with legal appeals or political maneuvering. He responded with the only language the mafia truly mastered: absolute, devastating violence. The target was not just any official, but the man who had become the living embodiment of the state's resolve, Giovanni Falcone. Falcone knew the danger. He knew that by breaking the seal of omerta, he had placed a permanent bullseye on his back. Yet he refused to hide. He continued his work, moving through a landscape where every shadow felt like a threat. But on that warm May morning, the threat became a physical reality. As Falcone's convoy traveled along the highway near the Capaci airport, a massive quantity of TNT, planted beneath the asphalt by mafia engineers, was detonated. The explosion was cataclysmic. The road buckled, the cars were tossed like toys, and in an instant Falcone, his wife, and 3 police escorts were gone. The shockwave of the Capaci bombing was felt far beyond the Sicilian coastline. It was a direct strike at the heart of the Italian Republic. The mafia had attempted to decapitate the state's ability to fight back. They wanted to prove that no matter how many convictions they faced, The cost of pursuing them would be paid in blood. But the predator was not finished. The Mafia's retaliation was not a single strike, but a campaign of terror designed to paralyze the nation. July 19, 1992. Palermo, Sicily. Just 57 days after the Capaci massacre, the Mafia struck again. This time, the target was Paolo Borsellino, Falcone's closest friend and colleague. As Borsellino's car sped through the streets of Palermo, a second massive bomb was detonated. The carnage was as brutal as the first, claiming the lives of Borsellino and 5 members of his security detail. The dual assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino were intended to be a message of dominance. It was a scream of defiance from the Corleonesi, an attempt to force the government into a retreat through sheer, unadulterated carnage. The streets of Palermo were filled with grief, but they were also filled with a burgeoning, white-hot rage. For the first time, the myth of the Mafia's untouchability was not just being challenged. It was being shattered by the very people they sought to intimidate. The deaths of these 2 men transformed them from mere prosecutors into secular martyrs. Their blood became the fuel for a new kind of resistance. The Mafia had expected the state to cower. They expected the chaos to create a vacuum that they could once again fill. Instead, they had inadvertently triggered a massive, unprecedented mobilization of civil society. The very violence intended to silence the law had instead given it a roar. The era of the untouchable boss was bleeding out on the Sicilian highways, and the battle for the soul of Sicily had entered its darkest, most violent, and most decisive chapter. July 19, 1993. Rome, Italy. The smoke from the bombings in Palermo had barely cleared when the war moved to the heart of the nation. From the streets of Rome to the historic sites of Florence, the Mafia unleashed a wave of terror that felt less like organized crime and more like a terrorist insurgency. They bombed museums, churches, and cultural landmarks, attempting to hold the entire Italian state hostage. They wanted to force a negotiation. They wanted to tear up the results of the Maxi trial and return to a world where the state stayed in its lane and the Mafia ruled the shadows. But they had miscalculated the chemistry of the Italian people. Instead of breaking, the state hardened. The era of the old world Mafia, the era of the flamboyant, territorial Don who ruled through visible presence and overt intimidation, was dying. The Corleonesi had fought with everything they had, but in their desperation to maintain control, they had committed the ultimate strategic error. They had made themselves an enemy of the people. The social contract that had allowed the Mafia to exist for a century, a silent, complicit coexistence, was being torn to shreds. As the Italian government responded with unprecedented emergency legislation and a massive deployment of military and police resources, the Mafia faced a brutal reality. The traditional methods of control, the public executions, the blatant extortion, the visible hierarchies, were now too dangerous to maintain. Every high-profile hit brought more heat, more surveillance, and more legislative teeth. The untouchable bosses were being hunted like animals. The result was a profound structural metamorphosis. To survive, the Mafia had to undergo a process of radical, forced evolution. They had to go underground, not just in a physical sense, but in a cultural and operational one. The old, centralized structure, where a single commission could dictate terms to the nation, began to fracture. The visible, glamorous underworld of the 1970s and 80s was being replaced by something far more insidious and difficult to detect. The Mafia began to shed its skin. The street-level thugs and the loud-mouthed capos were being phased out in favor of a more sophisticated, white-collar breed of criminal. The new mafia would not seek to conquer the streets through blood, but to infiltrate the economy through silence. They moved away from the violent spectacle of the Corleone and toward the quiet efficiency of the shadow economy. They traded the gun for the computer, the hitman for the money launderer, and the public threat for the subtle corruption of public contracts and international finance. The death of the old world was not a single event but a retreat into the darkness. The mafia didn't disappear, it simply became invisible. They learned that if you cannot win a war against the state, you must become a ghost within its systems. The era of the dawn was over. The era of the invisible syndicate had begun. The monster had not been slain. It had simply learned how to hide in plain sight. Late 1990s. Calabria, southern Italy. As the Sicilian Cosa Nostra retreated into the shadows, suffocated by the weight of its own violence and the relentless pressure of the Italian state, a new power was quietly ascending. It did not arrive with the fanfare of a conquering army or the dramatic flair of a Corleone takeover. Instead, it rose from the rugged, sun-drenched hills of the Calabrian Peninsula, growing with the slow, unstoppable inevitability of a creeping vine. This was the rise of the 'Ndrangheta. For decades, the 'Ndrangheta had been viewed by law enforcement and the public alike as a secondary player, a provincial, rural phenomenon compared to the global prestige of the Sicilian Mafia. While the Cosa Nostra was busy waging wars against the state, the 'Ndrangheta was busy building something fundamentally different. They were not looking for a fight with the government. They were looking for a way to bypass it entirely. The secret to their ascendancy lay in their DNA. Unlike the Sicilian Mafia, which relied on a somewhat centralized hierarchy and a commission that could be decapitated by a single high-profile trial, the 'Ndrangheta was built on the unbreakable bedrock of blood. Their structure was based on the 'Ndrina, small, autonomous cells composed almost entirely of family members. In the 'Ndrangheta, loyalty wasn't just a code, it was biological. To betray the organization was to betray your father, your brother, your cousin. This blood bond created a level of internal cohesion that the Sicilians, with their more political and social hierarchies, could never replicate. When a Sicilian boss turned informant, he was a traitor to the code. When an 'Ndrangheta member turned informant, he was a traitor to his own blood. As the Sicilian era of theatrical violence collapsed, the 'Ndrangheta seized the vacuum. They realized that the future of organized crime lay not in the control of territory through terror, but in the control of global supply chains through silence. While the world's eyes were fixed on the blood-soaked streets of Palermo, the Calabrian clans were quietly establishing themselves as the undisputed masters of the most lucrative commodity on earth, cocaine. By forging deep, ironclad connections with South American cartels, the 'Ndrangheta bypassed the traditional middlemen. They didn't just want a seat at the table, they wanted to own the kitchen. They transformed from a localized criminal group into a sophisticated, transnational logistics empire. They mastered the art of the invisible infiltration. They moved their wealth through a labyrinth of legitimate businesses, construction, waste management, and international finance, laundering billions with a clinical precision that left investigators chasing ghosts. They became the silent partner in the global economy. The shift of power was complete. The center of gravity for Italian organized crime had moved from the grand, tragic stage of Sicily to the impenetrable familial fortresses of Calabria. The Sicilian Mafia had fought the state and lost its grip. The 'Ndrangheta had embraced the shadows and found a way to rule the world. The era of the Don had indeed ended, but in its place, Something far more efficient, far more resilient, and far more dangerous had been born. The monster hadn't just learned to hide. It had learned how to become essential to the very system that sought to destroy it. Early 2000s. Milan, Italy. As the dust from the Maxi trials and the blood-soaked wars of the 90s settled, the face of organized crime underwent a profound surgical transformation. The era of the street thug and the visible boss was being replaced by something far more insidious, the era of the white-collar criminal. The traditional mafia had always been a parasite on the state, but the new generation, led by the hyper-efficient Ndrangheta and the remnants of the Sicilian clans, realized that violence was a liability. Bloodshed draws attention. Attention brings the police. The police bring the seizure of assets. To survive in a globalized world, the criminal enterprise had to stop acting like a gang and start acting like a multinational corporation. This required a mastery of the shadow economy. The problem for any drug syndicate is simple. How do you turn a mountain of dirty, crumpled, small-denomination bills from a street deal into a clean, digital balance sheet in a Swiss bank account? The answer is money laundering, the process of washing the filth of crime off of capital until it appears as legitimate profit. In the early years, this was a crude affair. It involved smurfing, breaking large sums of cash into tiny increments to avoid bank reporting thresholds, or using front businesses like laundromats and pizzerias to pad the books. But as the digital revolution took hold, the methods evolved into a sophisticated art form. The shadow economy began to bleed into the very pillars of the legitimate world. Construction became a primary vehicle. A mob-controlled firm would win a massive public contract, overcharge for materials, and use the excess, dirty cash to pay for ghost employees or fake subcontracting services. Suddenly, the blood money from a cocaine shipment in Gioia Tauro was being transformed into a new luxury apartment complex in Milan or a highway in Rome. Waste management became another frontier. By controlling the flow of refuse, criminal organizations could manipulate prices, create artificial scarcities, and move vast amounts of cash through a labyrinth of service contracts that were notoriously difficult for regulators to audit. But the true evolution happened in the realm of high finance. The criminals moved from the back alleys to the boardrooms. They leveraged shell companies in offshore tax havens, the Cayman Islands, Panama, Luxembourg, creating a dizzying web of ownership where the true beneficiary is hidden behind layers of legal proxies and nominee directors. They utilized trade-based money laundering, over-invoicing and under-invoicing goods to move value across borders without ever moving a single physical bill. This wasn't just about hiding money. It was about integration. By laundering their wealth into real estate, renewable energy, and hospitality, organized crime didn't just hide from the system. They became part of its foundation. They became the silent investors in your favorite shopping mall, the silent owners of the construction company building your office, and the silent partners in the banks that manage your savings. The shadow economy turned the mafia into a ghost in the machine. They had successfully decoupled the crime from the profit. Now, a judge could arrest a man for murder, but they could never truly touch the empire he had built because that empire no longer looked like crime. It looked like commerce. It looked like progress. And in the modern world, that makes it almost impossible to kill. 2010. Palermo, Sicily. While the mafia had successfully transitioned into the boardroom, a silent, grassroots rebellion was beginning to stir in the very streets they once terrorized. For decades, the culture of omertà, that suffocating code of silence, had been the Mafia's greatest shield. It wasn't just a rule enforced by bullets. It was a social fabric woven into the psyche of the community. To speak was to betray. To cooperate was to be a pariah. But the era of the ghost in the machine had a fundamental flaw. By embedding themselves into the legitimate economy, the Mafia had made their presence felt not through fear of violence, but through the erosion of civic life. They were the reason the bridge wasn't built. They were the reason the local hospital lacked supplies. They were the reason honest business owners went bankrupt while criminal fronts thrived. The resistance did not begin with guns or political coups. It began with a refusal to be afraid. This was the era of the Adiapizo movement. Born from a simple, radical act of defiance, a group of young entrepreneurs in Palermo decided they would no longer pay the pizzo, the extortion money demanded by local clans. They realized that the Mafia's power relied on a collective psychological surrender. By standing together and declaring, "We don't pay," they broke the monopoly of fear. They created a network of freedom shops, businesses that signaled to the public that they were untainted by criminal capital. It was a movement of economic disobedience that transformed the act of commerce into an act of political resistance. Parallel to this economic fight was a profound cultural awakening. For generations, the Mafia had been romanticized in cinema and literature as men of honor, tragic figures of a bygone era. But a new generation of Sicilian intellectuals, teachers, and journalists began to strip away the myth. They reframed the Mafia not as a way of life, but as a cancer, a predatory force that stunted the growth of the entire Mediterranean. In schools, educators began to teach the history of the fallen heroes, Falcone, Borsellino, and the countless nameless citizens who died simply for being honest. They turned the memory of the martyrs into a pedagogical tool, teaching children that silence was not honor, but complicity. This civil resistance also found its strength in the judicial system's evolution. As the Mafia moved into the digital and white-collar realms, the fight moved into the realm of forensic accounting and anti-Mafia legislation. Civil society began to demand more than just arrests. They demanded the total seizure of assets. They realized that you cannot defeat a corporation by simply arresting its CEO. You must dismantle its bank accounts, its real estate, and its shell companies. The battleground had shifted. It was no longer fought in the dark alleys of Corleone, but in the courtrooms of Palermo, in the cafes of the city center, and in the digital archives of investigative journalists. This was a war for the soul of Sicily. It was a struggle to reclaim the concept of legitimacy from those who had hijacked it. The modern Sicilian resistance proved that while a criminal empire can hide behind a ledger, it cannot survive the light of a community that refuses to look away. The Mafia had become a ghost in the machine, but the people were beginning to learn how to find the switch. 2015, New York City, USA. While the streets of Palermo were witnessing a spiritual reclamation, a different, more sterile transformation was unfolding in the skyscrapers of Manhattan and the financial districts of London. The era of the Tommy gun and the blood-stained sidewalk was fading into the annals of cinematic myth. The modern Mafia had realized a fundamental truth of the 21st century. Violence is expensive, it attracts attention, and it is inherently inefficient. If you want to build a kingdom, you don't kill the king, you buy his debt. If you want to control a city, you don't occupy its alleys, you infiltrate its supply chains. The invisible mob had completed its metamorphosis. The traditional soldier, once defined by his capacity for brutality, had been replaced by a new breed of operative, the white-collar professional. These were men who didn't wear tracksuits or carry concealed revolvers. They wore bespoke Italian suits, carried leather briefcases, and possessed an intimate understanding of complex tax codes, offshore banking, and shell corporations. They had traded the pizzo for the consultancy fee. This was the era of the sophisticated shadow economy. The Mafia's survival no longer depended on the physical control of territory, but on the manipulation of systems. They moved into the gray zones of legitimate commerce, construction, waste management, healthcare, and logistics. By embedding themselves into the very infrastructure of the modern state, they became nearly impossible to excise. They weren't just criminals, they were stakeholders. They were the silent partners in massive public works projects, and the invisible hands behind legitimate real estate empires. Money laundering became their primary art form. The goal was no longer to hide stolen cash in a basement, but to wash it through a dizzying labyrinth of legitimate businesses, cryptocurrency exchanges, and international wire transfers. They exploited the gaps in globalized finance, moving vast sums of illicit capital across borders faster than any law enforcement agency could track. The battlefield had shifted from the urban jungle to the digital ledger. This shift created a profound crisis for traditional policing. For decades, the FBI and Europol had perfected the art of hunting gunmen and drug kingpins. But how do you arrest a man who has never touched a weapon, who operates entirely through legal contracts and complex corporate structures? How do you prove a conspiracy when the orders are delivered via encrypted messages, and the hits are carried out through predatory lending or market manipulation? The violence had not disappeared, it had simply become structural. Instead of a bullet to the head, the modern mob used a lien on a property. Instead of a drive-by shooting, they used a hostile takeover. They weaponized the law against their rivals and used the complexity of the global economy as a cloak of invisibility. As the Mafia retreated into the shadows of the boardroom, they became a ghost in the global financial machine. They were no longer a localized threat to public order, but a systemic threat to the integrity of the world economy. The Don was no longer a man of honor in a dark room. He was a man of influence in a brightly lit office, orchestrating a symphony of corruption that was as silent as it was devastating. The war had changed. The enemy was no longer just hiding in the streets. They were hiding in plain sight, within the very systems we rely on to function. 2024. Tallinn, Estonia. In the quiet, blue-lit glow of a high-tech server farm, the final frontier of organized crime was being mapped out. If the previous era was defined by the manipulation of legal contracts and corporate structures, this new chapter was defined by the manipulation of code. The transition was seamless. The same predatory instincts that once drove a Sicilian boss to extort a local baker were now being applied to the global digital infrastructure. The cyber mafia did not need to control a physical street corner to collect tribute. They only needed to control a gateway to a network. The territory was no longer measured in city blocks, but in bits and bytes. This was the ultimate evolution of the invisible mob. The traditional hierarchy, the boss, the underboss, the capo, remained, but the skill set had undergone a radical mutation. The muscle was no longer a street soldier with a reputation for violence. The muscle was now a group of highly skilled, often anonymous, developers and data architects operating from jurisdictions where law enforcement's reach was non-existent. They were the new specialists, executing operations that could siphon millions of dollars from a pension fund or a cryptocurrency exchange in the time it took a traditional hitman to load a magazine. The methods were as diverse as they were devastating. Ransomware became the digital equivalent of the old protection racket. A corporation's entire data infrastructure would be held hostage, encrypted behind a wall of unbreakable code, with the pizzo demanded in untraceable Monero or Bitcoin. If the ransom wasn't paid, the organization didn't send a gunman to the CEO's house. They simply leaked sensitive client data, destroying the company's reputation and stock value in a single, surgical strike. Then there was the rise of sophisticated phishing and social engineering, the digital version of the con. Using deepfake technology and AI-driven voice cloning, these syndicates could impersonate high-level executives, bypassing the human element of security to authorize massive, fraudulent wire transfers. They exploited the psychological vulnerabilities of the digital age, turning trust into a weapon. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the cyber mafia was the marriage of traditional organized crime with the dark web. We began to see a convergence of old-world brutality and new-world anonymity. Traditional cartels and mafia clans began outsourcing their most sensitive operations, money laundering, identity theft, and the distribution of illicit goods, to professional cybercriminal syndicates. This created a symbiotic relationship. The traditional mob provided the physical infrastructure and the dirty cash, while the cybercriminals provided the digital camouflage and the tools to move that cash through the labyrinth of the blockchain. The battlefield had moved from the urban jungle to the dark web, and the casualties were no longer just individuals, but entire institutions. The threat was no longer localized. It was ubiquitous. A syndicate based in Eastern Europe could paralyze the banking system of a South American nation, or drain the digital wallets of thousands of retail investors in North America, all without ever stepping foot in the countries they were robbing. As we stand in this digital twilight, the definition of the mafia has been stretched to its breaking point. They have become a decentralized, borderless, and nearly incorporeal force. The code of silence has been replaced by the code of encryption. The shadow of the dawn no longer falls across a smoky backroom in New York, but across the very fiber-optic cables that bind our modern world together. The war for control has moved into the machine, and in this realm, the enemy is not just hiding in plain sight. They are part of the signal itself. 2024, Panama City, Panama, where the heavy, humid air of the tropics meets the sterile, high-frequency pulse of global finance. The distinction between a Sicilian don and a South American kingpin has all but evaporated. If the cyber mafia represented the digital mutation of the syndicate, then the rise of globalized networks represents its structural metamorphosis. We have moved past the era of isolated criminal fiefdoms. The old boundaries, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Americas, have been rendered obsolete by the sheer velocity of modern commerce. Today, the mafia does not compete with international cartels. It integrates with them. This is the era of the super syndicate. The traditional Cosa Nostra, once obsessed with territorial purity and bloodline, has undergone a pragmatic, if chilling, evolution. They have realized that in a hyper-connected world, sovereignty is a liability, but partnership is an asset. The old world hierarchies have become the logistical backbone for the new world chaos. Consider the flow of a single shipment of illicit narcotics. It no longer follows a predictable, linear path from a jungle lab to a street corner. Instead, it moves through a seamless, multi-layered web of cooperation. A Calabrian Ndrangheta clan provides the sophisticated money laundering channels through European real estate. A Mexican cartel provides the sheer industrial scale of production and distribution, and a Balkan network provides the hardened logistics and maritime routes. They are no longer separate entities fighting for a slice of the pie. They are a single, multinational corporation, operating with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company, but without the oversight of a board of directors or the constraints of the law. This fusion is driven by a shared necessity: the need to bypass the increasingly sophisticated surveillance of the modern state. To survive, these groups have adopted a model of modular criminality. They operate in specialized cells that rarely interact directly. The person moving the product in a shipping container in Rotterdam may never know the name of the person laundering the proceeds in a Dubai shell company, nor the person overseeing the production in the mountains of Colombia. This decentralization makes them nearly impossible to decapitate. When law enforcement takes down a boss, they aren't cutting off the head of a dragon. They are merely removing one node in a vast, self-healing network. The marriage of these worlds has created a terrifying synergy of brute force and financial sophistication. The cartels bring the muscle, the paramilitary capability to control territory and intimidate entire populations. The mafia brings the mind, the deep-rooted knowledge of shadow banking, political infiltration, and the exploitation of legitimate economic loopholes. Together, they create a loop of endless capital. The violence of the cartel secures the supply, and the sophistication of the mafia secures the profit. In this landscape, the concept of the territory has been redefined. It is no longer about holding a street corner in Palermo or a warehouse in New Jersey. It is about controlling the choke points of global trade, the ports, the free trade zones, the dark pools of liquidity, and the corridors of international transit. The shadow of the mafia has expanded to cover the entire globe. It is a ghost in the machine of international trade, a silent partner in the movement of global wealth. The traditional families have survived not by clinging to their old ways, but by abandoning them in favor of a globalized, borderless, and utterly relentless pursuit of power. The Don is no longer a man in a suit. He is a ghost in the network, a silent architect of a world where crime has no nationality and justice has no reach. 2024, Milan, Italy. In the sleek, glass-walled conference rooms of the Lombardy region, the silence is not the heavy, terrifying stillness of a Sicilian village, but the sterile quiet of a high-end hedge fund. To the untrained eye, nothing here suggests the presence of the underworld. But this is where the most profound structural shift in criminal history is being finalized: the total dissolution of the center. For nearly a century, the mythology of organized crime was defined by the Commission. Whether it was the American Five Families in New York or the historic governing bodies of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, there was always a summit. There was a board of directors. There was a hierarchy that could be mapped, a chain of command that could be understood, and crucially, a single point of failure. If you could arrest the Commission, you could theoretically paralyze the organism. But that era is dead. The modern clan has learned a lesson that the old world dons never mastered. Centralized power is a death sentence. As law enforcement agencies transition from local police to global task forces, utilizing the RICO Act and advanced signal intelligence, the traditional hierarchy became a liability. A centralized structure creates a paper trail. It creates witnesses. It creates a target. In response, The modern mafia has undergone a radical delayering. We are witnessing the transition from a pyramid to a web. In this new decentralized reality, the concept of the boss of bosses has been replaced by the independent operator. Modern clans function more like franchise models or specialized subcontractors than unified empires. They are autonomous units that share a common culture and a common code, but they operate with zero formal obligation to one another. Consider the modern Ndrangheta or the fragmented remnants of the American La Cosa Nostra. They no longer wait for a decree from a central authority to move into a new market or initiate a conflict. Instead, individual cells, often composed of tight-knit familial or even purely transactional cohorts, identify a niche and exploit it. One cell might specialize in the infiltration of green energy subsidies, another in the hijacking of digital assets, a third in the control of local waste management. They operate in parallel, often within the same city, without ever sitting at the same table. This headless structure is the ultimate defense against the state. When the FBI or the Carabinieri launch a massive crackdown, they are no longer looking for a king to topple. They are chasing shadows in a decentralized swarm. If one cell is compromised, the infection does not spread to the rest of the network. The cell is cauterized, the members are imprisoned, but the network remains intact. There is no head to cut off because the brain is distributed across 1,000 different nodes. This shift has fundamentally changed the nature of criminal diplomacy. In the old days, a war between families was settled by a mediator from the commission. Today, a conflict is settled through market forces or sudden, localized violence that has no broader strategic implication. There is no grand peace treaty, only the shifting of tactical advantages. The Mafia has traded the prestige of the throne for the invisibility of the ghost. They have traded the glory of the empire for the efficiency of the algorithm. By abandoning the commission, they have achieved the one thing every criminal organization dreams of: a structure that is as fluid as the global economy itself, and as impossible to kill as the wind. 2024. Los Angeles, California. In the dim light of a cinema screening room, the image on the screen is unmistakable. A man in a perfectly tailored suit, speaking in hushed, gravelly tones about loyalty, family, and the heavy burden of leadership. As the credits roll, the audience sits in a trance, captivated not by the violence they just witnessed, but by the perceived dignity of the criminal. This is the great paradox of the Mafia. While the actual history of the syndicate is one of blood, exploitation, and the systematic destruction of communities, its cultural legacy is one of profound, seductive myth. We are living in the shadow of a ghost, a romanticized version of the underworld that exists more in our collective imagination than in the gritty reality of the streets. For decades, the media has acted as the primary architect of this myth. From the operatic tragedies of Francis Ford Coppola to the stylish, hyper-violent fantasies of Martin Scorsese, the Mafia has been rebranded. It is no longer depicted as a parasitic entity that bleeds the working class dry through extortion and drug trafficking. Instead, it is presented as a dark mirror of the American dream, a meritocracy where a man from nothing can rise to the top through sheer will, unwavering discipline, and an ancient, sacred code of honor. We have fallen in love with the aesthetic of the man of honor. We crave the ritual of the blood oath, the solemnity of the sit-down, and the tragic nobility of the Don who is forced to choose between his soul and his family. We see the tuxedo, the fine wine, and the quiet respect of the neighborhood, and we mistake these trappings for substance. We romanticize the omerta as a beautiful expression of loyalty, forgetting that it is actually a tool of terror used to silence victims and protect murderers. This cultural sanitization has real-world consequences. When the mafia is viewed through a cinematic lens, its victims are erased. In the movies, the collateral damage is often just a nameless henchman or a rival mobster. But in reality, the victims are the shopkeepers whose livelihoods were stolen, the families shattered by heroin overdoses, and the entire social fabric of cities like Palermo or New York, which was torn apart by corruption. The romanticization creates a dangerous cognitive dissonance. It allows society to treat organized crime as a fascinating subculture, a dark, Shakespearean drama, rather than a systemic plague. It turns monsters into icons and thugs into philosophers. Even as the modern syndicate evolves into the invisible, decentralized web we have just discussed, the cultural ghost remains anchored to the old imagery. We look for the fedora and the cigar, while the real predators are wearing hoodies and sitting behind encrypted screens. The tragedy of the mafia's legacy is that the myth has become more durable than the organizations themselves. The five families may be fractured, the commission may be a relic of the past, the great dons may be dead or in hiding. But the idea of the mafia, the allure of the secret society, the magnetism of the outlaw, the seductive promise of power through shadow, is immortal. As long as we continue to find beauty in the shadow of the gun, the ghost of the mafia will never truly leave us. It will continue to haunt our screens, our stories, and our understanding of justice, masking the brutal reality of crime with the glittering veneer of legend. 2024, Palermo, Sicily. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting long, amber shadows across the ancient stone streets, one is forced to confront a chilling reality. The war on organized crime is not a battle that can be won with a single decisive blow. It is a war of attrition against an entity that refuses to die because it refuses to stay the same. For over a century, we have watched the mafia undergo a metamorphosis. We saw it transition from the agrarian extortionists of the Sicilian countryside to the flamboyant, street-level gangsters of the Prohibition era. We witnessed its peak during the mid-century, when it sat at the head of legitimate industries, and we watched it crumble under the weight of RICO prosecutions and the relentless pursuit of judges like Giovanni Falcone. But as the old structures fell, something more terrifying emerged from the rubble. The question is no longer whether we can defeat the mafia, but rather, what are we actually fighting? The traditional mafia was a creature of geography. You could find them in a specific social club in East Harlem. You could track them to a specific villa in Corleone. They had hierarchies, they had faces, and they had a centralized command. This made them vulnerable. You could cut off the head and the body would eventually wither. But the modern criminal syndicate has abandoned the need for a head. Today, we are facing a decentralized, liquid form of organized crime. The new predators do not seek to control a neighborhood. They seek to control a network. They operate in the gray spaces between jurisdictions, utilizing the very tools of globalization that have connected the world. They use the same high-speed fiber optics that power our economies to move billions in laundered assets through a labyrinth of shell companies and cryptocurrency. They have traded the heavy Tommy gun for the sophisticated algorithm and the encrypted messaging app. In this new landscape, the mafia is becoming an invisible ghost in the machine. It is a fusion of traditional blood ties and digital anonymity. When a crime is committed via a distributed network of cyber specialists, where is the crime scene? When money moves through a blockchain from a server in Eastern Europe to a bank in the Caribbean, where is the territory? The state is playing a game of checkers against an opponent playing three-dimensional chess. While law enforcement is still perfecting the tools to track physical shipments of narcotics, the syndicates are already moving into the realms of data theft, identity fraud, and the manipulation of global supply chains. They have become a parasite that doesn't just live off the host, but integrates itself into the host's very nervous system. So, can the mafia ever truly be defeated? If your definition of victory is the total eradication of organized crime, the answer is likely a haunting no. As long as there is a profit to be made in the shadows, as long as there is a way to bypass the law through technology or corruption, there will be a syndicate to exploit it. The mafia is not just a group of men. It is a response to the failures of the state, a byproduct of inequality, and a shadow cast by the light of progress. To truly defeat it, we would have to solve the fundamental vulnerabilities of the modern world. Until then, the mafia will continue to evolve, forever retreating into the darkness, only to emerge again in a new, unrecognizable form.